Okay, here's the cylinder head. And before we get into actual oiling issues, just some fairly obvious things. The cylinder head has 4 valves per cylinder, centrally located spark plug, 2, 3. We'll take a peek at the bottom side. And through here, I recognize because the camshaft opening is bigger, these are going to be the intake valve side. This is going to be the exhaust valve side. And of course, I wasn't even aware of it when I bought this car, but this has the VarioCam Plus. So on the exhaust side, the camshaft looks pretty standard. And on the intake side, it's crazy looking. And I will post some animations I found online on how this all works. But this end of the exhaust camshaft has a much bigger housing, and we'll come back to it. It has some oil feed requirements that are very important to make the VarioCam Plus part work. So I don't know if you remember, but I said that head stud bolts 1, 2, 3, and 5 seem to be pressurized with oil. And if I come around here and look, here's number 1. When I spray cleaner down in this hole, there's a passageway that comes from head stud hole number 1. Here's number 2. So that diagonal passage comes out onto this shiny area. 3 is the same deal. That goes out into this shiny area. We skip 4, and then on 5, we have an oil passage. So, as far as I can tell, 100% of the oil that the head requires to operate comes up through cylinder head. This is just my own numbering, but 1, 2, 3, and 5. If we look at this fancy piece, which sits down over that, there are castings on the bottom that match the quote-unquote shiny areas that I showed you here. And there's also this big opening here that matches that area in the middle. So these 3 openings plus this 4th one are charged with oil. And that might have it backwards. That sits down there like that. And there's going to be oil supplied to the various lifters. If you look at like a hole right there, it's a little hard to see. There's a hole right there, 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 and on the other side. So there's basically, now that I look at it, I see there's an oil gallery that runs down the middle and another oil gallery that runs down this side. And you can see the little reinforcements for the passageways. So this is all charged to pressurized oil, which goes over to the hydraulic lifters, which are pressurized with oil, and that's what keeps them working correctly. So I think if we glance over here at a lifter, you'll see they have a ring around the edge, and then there's a hole in the side, and the oil gets in there and quote unquote pumps up the lifter. The intake lifters are a little more sophisticated. So that got oil to all the lifters. When I started looking at the cam bearings, I'm frankly a little confused. I do not see oiling for these cam bearings. It could be what we call splash oiling. I'm just not sure. I'll probably get educated on that before I wrap this up. But at this point, I do know that there's the camshafts sit in these areas right here, and certainly they have to be lubricated. But probably the big kahuna here is this area right here is going to match up with this piece on the VarioCam, and that's going to be the actuator that rotates the cam timing wise, and also that oil feed is used to activate the fancy lifters that are used on the intake. So yeah, I think that's about it for the head. I'll maybe swing back around to that a little bit later. Okay, I mentioned I wasn't quite sure how the camshaft bearings got lubricated. Well, now that I'm looking, each camshaft bearing has a hole in the side, and I suspect there's what we would call a center feed oil passageway that runs down the center of the camshaft and pushes oil out through each one of those holes and keeps those bearings nicely lubricated. I can't quite tell where the center feed is on the exhaust. It could quite possibly just come in at this end. So here's something that you may not think about, and we really haven't discussed how the oil gets back to the sump. In many cases, it's pretty straightforward, and I haven't actually gone through this enough to know, but I will pick up with that. But shell type bearings where the oil is injected into the bearing face, for them to work, you know, there's a film thickness of oil between the two bearing pieces that has to stay there. And really for that to work, the oil has to continue to flow from the injection point out, and then it drizzles out around the ends of the bearing. So some bearings, and this one is a pretty good example, there's what you call a return path, and the bearing is going to drizzle some oil out. It's going to drizzle oil out to this direction, but it could get dried out if there wasn't a way hydrostatically for the oil to get out from the far end of the bearing. And there's a little cap on this so that you don't have oil puking out of your cylinder head. So this is what I would call a return path right here. And basically, very small amounts of oil get out from the far side of the bearing, and then they drizzle around and they fall down in, and then they make their way back to the sump. When you start to look around an engine, sometimes you'll see return paths that you hadn't really thought about. And it is important that they exist and they, be kept clear. I know a friend of mine came over to look at the engine. He said, yeah, there's a little leftover sealant down in this return path. And if somebody got really sloppy with the sealant and filled the return path up, then you'd have a problem and you may lose this bearing due to poor lubrication. So yeah, keep an eye on return paths. I'm going to do another video later to try and figure out exactly how I think things get back to the sump. I've figured out how they came up from the sump, and I suspect there's a fairly major passageway. Most of the time, oil returning to the sump is just a gravity situation. But we'll see when I get into that.